For months, the story sounded simple, almost boring. A routine roster decision explained away with familiar language that sports fans have heard for decades. Experience matters. Chemistry matters. Fit matters. The explanation felt neat, controlled, and final. And most people accepted it because that's how power survives, by presenting decisions as technical instead of personal. But this one never sat right. Because when you strip away the press conference tone and the carefully chosen words, the reality underneath tells a very different story. This wasn't about readiness. It wasn't about defense. It wasn't about physicality or learning curves. It wasn't even about winning gold. What happened here was something far more uncomfortable for the people in charge. It was about control, and more specifically, the fear of losing it. The moment the Olympic roster dropped, the conversation exploded. Not because of who made the team, but because of who didn't. Caitlin Clark wasn't just absent. She was erased from a stage that should have been inevitable. And at first, the official messaging did what it was designed to do. It slowed the outrage. It softened the questions. It gave analysts something safe to repeat. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Leaks started surfacing. Not dramatic whistleblowers. Not viral exposés. Quiet confirmations. Subtle admissions. Conversations that were never meant to leave internal meetings suddenly found their way into public view. And those leaks all pointed to the same unsettling truth. Basketball wasn't the reason. It was the excuse. The real concern wasn't whether Caitlin Clark could contribute. Everyone involved knew she could. The concern was what happened if she didn't play enough. What happened if she sat on the bench? What happened if millions of viewers tuned in expecting her, and didn't get her? The fear wasn't failure on the court, it was backlash off it. That changes everything. Because once a governing body starts making decisions based on how loud fans might be, instead of how good a player actually is, the structure cracks. It means the system isn't confident in its own authority. It means control feels fragile. And fragile systems don't adapt. They isolate threats. What looked like a roster omission begins to resemble something else entirely. A preventative move. A calculated removal. Not because the player wasn't ready, but because the moment was. And that's where this story truly begins. Not with a jump shot, or a stat line, or a box score, but with fear. Fear of attention. Fear of influence. Fear that the biggest star in women's basketball had become bigger than the institution meant to contain her. When organizations stop asking how to win and start asking how to manage perception, the game changes. And once that line is crossed, no explanation, no matter how polished, can fully hide what's underneath. This wasn't a basketball decision. It was a signal. At first, the explanation held. It always does. When authority speaks calmly and confidently, most people assume the details exist somewhere behind the curtain. Experience. Fit. Chemistry. The words sound reasonable because they've been used for years to justify decisions no one wants to fully explain. And for a brief moment, that script worked again. But then the leaks started. Not the loud kind. Not someone chasing clout. These were small confirmations coming from inside conversations that were never meant to become public. Bits of information that didn't match the official story. When you line them up, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The internal debate around Caitlin Clark had almost nothing to do with basketball. According to multiple insiders, the dominant concern inside USA Basketball wasn't whether Clark could help the team win. It was what would happen if she didn't play enough minutes once she was there. The fear wasn't that she would struggle. The fear was that she would succeed too loudly, and that any decision to limit her role would trigger backlash they didn't want to manage. That detail matters. Because it means the evaluation process was flipped on its head. Instead of asking, how do we maximize our best talent? The conversation became, how do we minimize potential distractions? And in that framework, popularity becomes dangerous. Attention becomes a problem. Fans become something to contain instead of something to serve. One insider reportedly summed it up bluntly. If Clark was on the roster and didn't play, the noise would be unbearable. Every substitution would be questioned. Every rotation decision would be dissected. Every camera cut to the bench would ignite social media. The staff didn't want to coach under that microscope. So rather than face it, they removed the source. That's not team building. That's risk avoidance. And once that truth surfaced, the polite illusion collapsed. This wasn't about protecting the team. It was about protecting comfort. About preserving a structure that works best when no single player draws too much gravity. When stars exist, but only within approved limits. Think about what that implies. A player wasn't excluded because she lacked readiness. She was excluded because her presence would force accountability. Because every decision involving her would be visible. Because the audience would care. That admission reframes everything. It reveals a system that values quiet over excellence, stability over growth, control over momentum. And when that system feels threatened, it doesn't adapt. It isolates. What makes the leak even more damaging is that it confirms something fans long suspected but were told not to say out loud. That the issue was never talent. It was power. Who gets to decide the narrative? Who absorbs the spotlight? And who gets to operate without scrutiny? By trying to avoid controversy, they created something far worse. Because now the question isn't why Caitlin Clark wasn't selected. The question is why the people in charge were so afraid of what her presence would expose. And once that question is asked publicly, there's no going back to the old explanations. Once the leak was out, the logic behind the decision stopped pretending to be technical. It became psychological. The issue wasn't whether Caitlin Clark could fit into the system. The issue was that the system couldn't fit around her. For years, the structure of elite women's basketball operated on a quiet understanding. Stars were welcome, even celebrated, as long as they didn't disrupt the hierarchy. Attention was fine when it arrived gradually. Fame was acceptable when it could be managed. But Clark arrived differently. She didn't climb the ladder step by step. She kicked the door in. Her audience didn't grow over seasons. It arrived all at once. Millions of fans, many of whom had never followed women's basketball closely before, suddenly tuned in for one player. Ratings spiked. Arenas sold out. Social media followed her every move. And with that attention came something the establishment wasn't prepared to handle: expectation. Expectation creates pressure. Pressure creates accountability. And accountability makes people uncomfortable. Inside decision-making circles, that discomfort turned into resistance. Clark wasn't viewed as a basketball problem. She was viewed as a control problem. Because once someone commands that much attention, every decision involving them becomes public property. You can't quietly bench them. You can't downplay their role. You can't pretend they're interchangeable. And that's the real threat. In closed-door discussions, the fear wasn't that Clark would demand special treatment. By all accounts, she didn't. The fear was that the public would demand it on her behalf. That the fans would ask questions the staff didn't want to answer. Why isn't she playing? Why is she standing in the corner? Why does the offense look stagnant without her touch? Those questions don't just challenge coaching decisions. They challenge authority. So instead of confronting that reality, the organization chose avoidance. Remove the variable. Eliminate the scenario. If she's not there, the pressure disappears. The rotations stay quiet. The hierarchy stays intact. The power structure remains untested. But there's a cost to that approach. When you treat popularity as a liability, you reveal that your system is fragile. Strong systems absorb attention. Weak ones deflect it. And the decision to keep Clark off the roster wasn't about preserving harmony. It was about preserving insulation. This is why the explanations never fully landed. Because fans could feel the contradiction. How does the most watched player in the sport suddenly become a distraction? How does the person driving growth become a problem for the game's biggest stage? The answer is uncomfortable, but simple. Growth brings chaos. Chaos brings scrutiny. And scrutiny exposes cracks that have been there for years. Caitlin Clark didn't create those cracks. She illuminated them. And once the spotlight hits a system built for shadows, control becomes harder to maintain. To people outside sports culture, a jersey number looks insignificant. Just fabric. Just a digit. Something interchangeable. But inside elite competition, numbers carry meaning. They carry identity. They carry hierarchy. And when they're taken away, it's never accidental. For Caitlin Clark, the number 22 isn't just what she wears. It's what she's known for. It's tied to record-breaking nights, logo-range shots, sold-out arenas, and a generation of young players who show up wearing the same number on their backs. It's branding, yes, but it's also respect. It's continuity. It's recognition of what a player represents. So when Team USA extended training camp invitations and quietly reassigned that number, the message was immediate to anyone who understands the politics of the game. This wasn't a clerical decision. This wasn't bad timing. This was intentional. Clark was given a different number. Her number. The one synonymous with her rise. Handed to someone else. In the world of elite basketball, that is a statement. It says, nothing you did before matters here. It says, you don't arrive as a star. You arrive as a subordinate. It's a way to reset the power balance before a word is ever spoken. This kind of move isn't about rules. There is no regulation that forces a change like that. It's about dominance. About drawing a line before the player ever steps onto the floor. You are welcome, but only on our terms. What makes the move more revealing is how unnecessary it was. Team USA didn't gain anything competitive by doing this. No strategic advantage. No chemistry boost. All it accomplished was signaling resistance. And that's why so many people read it as disrespect instead of protocol. Because if the goal was integration, you wouldn't start by stripping identity. You wouldn't take the most recognizable symbol associated with a player and hand it away without explanation. You wouldn't ignite a cultural backlash over something so easily avoidable. Unless the point was the backlash. Unless the goal was to remind Clark, and everyone watching, that no matter how large her presence had become elsewhere, she would not be allowed to arrive with that same status here. That this environment had its own rules. Its own hierarchy. Its own gatekeepers. This wasn't about humility. Clark had already shown that. This was about containment. And when institutions start using symbolism to reassert control, it usually means the battle has already shifted from performance to power. Every power struggle eventually reveals a face. In this one, that face belongs to Cheryl Reeve. And this is where the story stops being about abstract systems and starts becoming personal. Reeve wasn't a silent participant in this situation. Long before Olympic rosters were announced, long before leaks reached the public, the tone had already been set. Early in the WNBA season, comments began surfacing that urged people to calm down about the hype surrounding Caitlin Clark. On the surface, those remarks sounded measured, reasonable, veteran caution from a coach who values structure. But context matters. Those comments didn't exist in isolation. They landed at a moment when Clark hadn't even played a professional game yet, and still managed to dominate the conversation around the league. Instead of embracing the attention, the message was restraint. Temper expectations. Slow the narrative. Keep things in their place. Then came the social media signals. The likes. The indirect responses. The selective silence when praise was flowing elsewhere. None of it was overt enough to trigger backlash on its own. But together, it painted a picture of resistance rather than mentorship. When the Olympic snub finally happened, Reeve's response sealed it. There was no acknowledgement of the optics. No recognition of the impact. No admission that leaving the most watched player in the sport at home might raise legitimate questions. The tone wasn't conflicted. It was firm. Almost dismissive. The message was clear. This wasn't a mistake worth reconsidering. And that's where the dynamic shifted. Because when leadership refuses to even entertain the possibility that they misjudged something, it stops being about evaluation and starts being about ego. Insiders later confirmed that Reeve's mindset didn't just influence public messaging. It shaped internal philosophy. The idea that Clark needed to be put in her place wasn't whispered, it was normalized. The emphasis wasn't on how to integrate her strengths. It was on maintaining control of the system. This is a classic clash in sports history. The system versus the outlier. Coaches who built success through structure often struggle when a player arrives who bends the structure around them. Not because the player is uncoachable, but because they change the balance of power. Reeve represents tradition, defense, hierarchy, earned roles. Caitlin Clark represents a new era, spacing that breaks schemes, range that warps coverage, attention that doesn't ask permission. Those two philosophies were always going to collide. And when they did, the system chose itself. This is the part of the story that never shows up in official statements. No press release. No transcript. Just whispers from practices and camps that people inside the game immediately recognize as familiar. The allegation isn't that Caitlin Clark was bad in limited national team settings. It's that she was neutralized. Multiple insiders have suggested that during the few opportunities where Clark was involved in Team USA environments, the offense was never designed to flow through her strengths. Instead of movement shooting, instead of high screens that stretch coverage, instead of sets that weaponize her range, she was parked, stationary, treated as a spacer rather than a creator. That matters, because you don't accidentally misuse a player like that. Coaches at this level understand exactly what they're doing. They know how to highlight strengths. They know how to hide weaknesses. When those choices go the opposite direction, it's intentional. Witnesses described possessions where Clark stood in the corner while the offense ran elsewhere. Sequences where she never touched the ball. Moments where defenders could ignore her movement entirely. For the greatest shooter of her generation, that's not basketball logic. That's message sending. It fits a familiar pattern in elite sports. If you want to justify a decision, you first need evidence. If the evidence doesn't exist naturally, you manufacture conditions that produce it. Limit opportunities. Remove rhythm. Break confidence. Then point to the result and say, "See? Not ready." This tactic has a name in locker rooms, even if no one says it publicly. Gatekeeping. Set someone up to fail just enough that the outcome looks organic. Not blatant. Not obvious. Just quiet enough to defend. And when fans ask why she didn't pop, the answer is ready-made. But the comparison that keeps coming up from people who watched closely is telling. It's like buying a Ferrari and refusing to shift out of first gear just to prove you're still the driver. The goal isn't performance. It's control. What makes this especially damaging is that it contradicts everything we've seen when Clark plays freely. In environments where the offense is allowed to breathe, she elevates everyone. Defenses stretch. Passing lanes open. Teammates benefit. But those conditions were never recreated here. Instead, the atmosphere was described as rigid, cold, unwelcoming, not the kind of place where creativity thrives. And when a player senses they're being evaluated under a microscope rather than supported, it changes how they play. Anyone who's been in competitive sports understands that. The freeze-out wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was subtle, professional, and deniable, which is exactly why it worked. Until it didn't. This is where the script flipped, and almost no one saw it coming. For decades, the expected response to a snub like this has been predictable. A statement from an agent. A carefully worded quote about being disappointed but respectful. A promise to work harder. A public show of humility meant to smooth things over and keep doors open. That's not what happened here. Instead of noise, there was silence. No interviews. No cryptic posts. No passive-aggressive comments. When optional minicamp invitations went out, Caitlin Clark didn't rush to prove anything. She didn't show up late. She didn't show up early. She didn't show up at all. She declined. On the surface, that sounds harmless. Rest. Recovery. Off-season focus. Completely reasonable explanations that anyone could accept. But inside elite sports organizations, that decision lands very differently. Because absence is leverage. By choosing not to participate, Clark did something far more powerful than protesting ever could. She withdrew value. She made it clear, without saying a word, that access to her presence is not automatic. That if she's not respected, she's not obligated to play along. This wasn't a tantrum. It was calculated restraint. Organizations can spin criticism. They can dismiss outrage. They can survive bad headlines. What they struggle with is irrelevance. And Clark understands something many players don't learn until late in their careers. Her absence speaks louder than her frustration ever could. When she doesn't appear, ratings dip. Conversations shift. Highlights disappear. And suddenly, the spotlight the organization tried to avoid doesn't go away, it turns inward. Silence forces reflection. It also exposes dependency. Because the uncomfortable truth is that modern basketball ecosystems don't run on medals alone. They run on attention, on viewership, on engagement. And when the most magnetic figure in the sport quietly steps away, the vacuum becomes obvious. This move terrified decision-makers more than any angry statement would have. Because it removed their ability to frame the narrative. They couldn't argue against it. They couldn't punish it. They could only feel the absence. And once that absence started to register, the conversation stopped being about discipline or hierarchy. It became about something far more dangerous for the people in charge. Money. This is where everything stops being philosophical and starts becoming unavoidable. Because no matter how much tradition, hierarchy, or ideology you wrap around a decision, there is one force that always cuts through it cleanly. Money. And Caitlin Clark sits directly at the center of it. Nike didn't commit to Caitlin Clark on vibes or hype alone. The reported investment, tens of millions tied to endorsements, marketing campaigns, and a future signature line, was made with one expectation in mind: global visibility. Nike doesn't just sell shoes. It sells moments, faces, cultural relevance. And Clark was positioned to be exactly that on the world's biggest stage. A Team USA appearance wasn't optional in that equation. It was foundational. The Olympics are not just a basketball event. They are a global advertising platform disguised as competition. And the network carrying that platform, NBC, understands this better than anyone. Ratings drive ad revenue. Ad revenue drives leverage. And Clark-driven basketball has already proven what it can do. During the WNBA season, the data became impossible to ignore. Games featuring Clark shattered viewership records that had stood untouched for decades. Arenas sold out. Broadcast numbers surged. Meanwhile, games without her presence quietly slid back toward baseline. Not disastrous, but not transformative. That contrast matters. Because when sponsors and broadcasters run projections for future events, they don't gamble on tradition. They gamble on attention. And attention follows stars. Inside corporate offices, the concern wasn't subtle. A Team USA program that sidelines its most marketable athlete isn't just making a basketball choice. It's undermining its own business ecosystem. Nike invests in Team USA. Nike invests in Caitlin Clark. Those two paths are supposed to align, not collide. And yet, that's exactly what happened. The result was tension. Not public, but real. Corporate frustration doesn't leak the way locker room drama does, but it applies pressure all the same. Quiet calls. Uncomfortable meetings. Questions that don't need to be asked out loud to be felt. How do you justify leaving your biggest asset off the biggest stage? How do you explain declining engagement when the solution is sitting at home? The 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles loom over all of this like a countdown clock. Home soil. Prime-time coverage. A once-in-a-generation opportunity for women's basketball to fully break through. Every projection assumes a face. A focal point. A player casual viewers recognize instantly. Right now, that face is Caitlin Clark. And the longer this standoff continues, the more obvious the imbalance becomes. The coaches can enforce structure. Committees can defend precedent. But they cannot ignore economics forever. Because medals fade. Revenue doesn't. And when business interests and coaching ideology collide, history tells us one of them eventually gives way. At this point, The conflict stopped being about one player and became a referendum on the direction of the sport itself. Two sides emerged, not officially, but unmistakably. And the line between them couldn't have been clearer. On one side stood the establishment. Coaches, long-tenured decision-makers, veteran voices who built their careers in an era where progress was slow and hierarchy was sacred. In that world, nothing was handed out. You earned minutes through silence. You waited your turn. You fit into the system before the system ever bent for you. Attention was something you survived, not something you chased. On the other side stood the future. Fans, broadcasters, sponsors, and a new generation of players who understand that visibility isn't a threat, it's the lifeline. They see stars not as disruptions, but as engines. They don't fear the spotlight. They build around it. Caitlin Clark became the dividing line between those two philosophies. What the leak about fan backlash exposed was more than insecurity. It revealed a belief that the audience itself is a problem. That fans asking questions is dangerous. That engagement needs to be managed instead of welcomed. That growth must be controlled, even if that means slowing it down. That mindset is fatal in modern sports. Because fans are no longer passive. They don't just watch highlights on delay and accept what they're told. They analyze rotations. They clip possessions. They track usage. And when something doesn't make sense, they say so, loudly. Trying to suppress that response doesn't make it disappear. It multiplies it. By excluding Clark to avoid a circus, the establishment created the biggest circus imaginable. Every Team USA game became about who wasn't there. Every cold shooting stretch triggered comparisons. Every stagnant possession invited questions. The absence became louder than any presence ever could. And the most damaging part is this. The establishment chose familiarity over relevance. They chose a team that felt comfortable internally over one that inspired externally. They prioritized maintaining order over accelerating momentum. In doing so, they revealed how disconnected leadership had become from the audience that actually fuels the sport. This wasn't protection. It was preservation. Preservation of roles. Preservation of authority. Preservation of a version of the game that works best when attention stays contained and stars stay manageable. But the future doesn't wait for permission. And the longer the establishment resists it, the more forcefully it arrives. Sports history has a way of repeating itself, especially when ego gets involved. And for anyone who understands Olympic basketball, this situation carries an uncomfortable echo from the past. In 1992, one of the greatest American players of his era was left off the most iconic roster ever assembled. Isaiah Thomas wasn't excluded because he couldn't play. He was excluded because relationships were fractured, power dynamics were tense, and certain voices didn't want to share space with him. The result became legend. Not because it was justified, but because it was personal. That decision haunted the sport for decades. The difference now is timing. Isaiah Thomas was at the tail end of his prime. His career arc was already established. Caitlin Clark, by contrast, is standing at the very beginning of hers. This isn't a veteran being phased out. This is a generational talent being alienated before her Team USA story even starts. And that's what makes the parallel so dangerous. Olympic snubs don't just hurt feelings. They fracture trust. Once a player believes decisions are being made for reasons unrelated to performance, the relationship rarely recovers fully. Even if reconciliation happens on the surface, the scar remains underneath. History shows this clearly. Some bridges never get rebuilt. Others only get crossed reluctantly. What's alarming here is how early that fracture is forming. Clark isn't declining. She isn't fading. She isn't being replaced. She's ascending. And the message being sent is that ascension itself is the problem. That's backwards. In most successful systems, rising stars are integrated early. They're guided, protected, positioned, not isolated, not tested through humiliation, not quietly punished for drawing attention. By choosing resistance instead of adaptation, the program risks repeating a mistake that men's basketball still debates 30 years later. The only difference is that the consequences now extend far beyond one roster. They affect sponsorships, ratings, future Olympic cycles. The next 3 games, 2028, 2032, 2036, should have been building blocks. Instead, they're becoming question marks. And once history starts asking those questions, it rarely does so gently. This is the question no one inside the system wants to answer out loud, but it's the one hanging over everything now. Not whether Caitlin Clark can play for Team USA in the future, but whether she ever will again. Because once trust is damaged at this level, talent alone doesn't repair it. From Clark's perspective, the warning signs are already there. Private concerns leaked to the media. Identity stripped through symbolic gestures. Decisions justified by fear of fans instead of basketball logic. A coaching environment that appears more interested in containment than collaboration. None of that inspires confidence. None of that suggests a future built on mutual respect. If she returns under the same leadership, what changes? Does the mindset suddenly shift? Do the people who viewed her popularity as a liability now treat it as an asset? Or does she walk back into the same rigid structure, expected to prove herself again under conditions that were never neutral to begin with? That's the dilemma. Clark doesn't need Team USA to validate her career. She has the WNBA. She has record-breaking viewership. She has endorsements that rival athletes with decades of international exposure. She has sold-out arenas and a fan base that follows her wherever she plays. Participation is no longer a necessity, it's a choice. Team USA, on the other hand, does need her. It needs relevance. It needs a bridge to new audiences. It needs a focal point as women's basketball enters its most commercially important decade. That imbalance is what makes this situation so volatile. Power has quietly shifted. And power shifts make people nervous. The silence from Clark's camp only reinforces that shift. There's no long-term commitment being offered. No enthusiastic talk about future Olympic cycles. No public declarations of loyalty. Just quiet distance. And in elite sports, distance is rarely accidental. There is a very real scenario where Clark decides the cost isn't worth it. Where she prioritizes environments that celebrate her presence instead of managing it. Where she builds her legacy without international uniforms, and lets the system feel the consequences of that absence. If that happens, it won't be sudden. It will be gradual. Less engagement. Less anticipation. Less cultural weight. A slow realization that something irreplaceable was pushed away not because it failed, but because it didn't fit neatly into an old framework. This isn't a threat. It's a trajectory. And unless something changes at the structural level, the most shocking outcome won't be that Caitlin Clark never wore a Team USA jersey again. It will be that, over time, people stopped expecting her to. There's a reason this situation feels unresolved, even after weeks of debate, analysis, and speculation. It's because the loudest voice in the entire story still hasn't spoken. And that silence is doing more damage than any interview ever could. Normally, when a player of this magnitude is snubbed, the response is immediate. A statement gets released. Respect is emphasized. Optimism is projected. Bridges are publicly protected, even if they're privately damaged. That's how these situations are usually handled. This one isn't. After the initial professionalism, everything went quiet. No reaffirmation of future commitment. No hints about upcoming camps. No language about earning the next opportunity. Just distance. And that's what unsettles the people in charge the most. Because silence can't be spun. It doesn't offer a narrative to push back against. It doesn't provide a quote to dissect. It doesn't give critics something to attack. It simply exists. And in that empty space, reality fills in on its own. Every sold-out arena without her on a national team roster becomes a reminder. Every spike in ratings tied to her name becomes evidence. Every conversation about the future of the sport circles back to the same uncomfortable truth. The system tried to slow something it didn't understand, and in doing so, revealed its own limitations. What makes this especially damaging is that the original justification has already collapsed. Once it was admitted, directly or indirectly, That fear of fan reaction influenced the decision. The moral high ground disappeared. The authority that comes from merit-based selection weakened. And when that authority weakens, players notice. Others are watching this unfold closely. Not just rookies, but veterans too. They see what happens when popularity challenges hierarchy. They see how quickly narratives change when control feels threatened. And they file that information away for later. This is how trust erodes across an entire ecosystem. Because the message isn't just about one player anymore. It's about what kind of behavior is rewarded. About whether excellence is enough. About whether visibility is embraced or punished. And once those questions start circulating, they don't stop at one roster cycle. The irony is that everything the leadership feared has already happened. The distraction, the scrutiny, the constant comparison. All of it arrived anyway. Only now, it's attached to absence instead of presence. Trying to minimize attention only magnified it. And that's why this moment matters more than any individual decision. It exposed a philosophical fault line that had been buried for years. Between growth and control. Between evolution and preservation. Between serving the game and protecting the gate. Silence didn't create this reckoning. It revealed it. When all the noise fades, when the hot takes slow down, and when the explanations stop shifting, what's left is a simple truth that's hard to escape. This situation was never about basketball excellence. It was about fear. Fear of attention. Fear of accountability. Fear of a moment that arrived faster than the system was prepared to handle. The leak didn't damage Caitlin Clark. It exposed the people who made the decision. It revealed a leadership structure more concerned with preserving comfort than embracing growth. A culture that saw fan engagement as a problem instead of a gift. A mindset that confused control with stability, and tradition with progress. And once that mindset was exposed publicly, it lost the power it relied on most: credibility. What makes this moment so consequential isn't just what happened, but what happens next. Because systems like this don't usually collapse all at once. They fade. They lose relevance. They lose energy. They lose connection with the audience that keeps them alive. And that process often starts with pushing away the very people who could have carried them forward. Caitlin Clark doesn't need revenge to win this chapter. She doesn't need speeches or confrontations. She doesn't even need Team USA to validate her legacy. Her leverage already exists in sold-out arenas, record-breaking viewership, and a fan base that follows her wherever she goes. The harder the system resists that reality, the more obvious its limitations become. And history is clear about how these stories usually end. Stars don't shrink to fit old structures. Structures either evolve to support them, or they get left behind. The attempt to suppress a moment rarely works. It just delays the inevitable shift, often making it more dramatic when it finally arrives. This wasn't the end of a career. It was a crossroads, a warning, and a reminder that fear is a terrible way to run a dynasty. Now the question isn't whether the system will change. It's whether it will do so in time. If you found this breakdown valuable, and you want more deep, story-driven analysis that goes beyond headlines and exposes what's really happening behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps this channel grow and allows us to keep producing long-form, high-retention breakdowns like this one. Don't forget to like the video if this analysis gave you a new perspective. It helps the algorithm push this content to more basketball fans who want real context, not recycled talking points. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about this situation, where you believe the responsibility truly lies, and how you see the future unfolding. This story isn't finished, and neither is the shift it represents. Thanks for watching.